It was a bright and warm afternoon in the heart of the city. People were walking along the sidewalks, chatting and enjoying the sun. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from a nearby bakery and of coffee brewing in the cafes lining the streets. Children ran past, their laughter echoing between the buildings. The city had its usual hum of life, but at one particular corner, the noise seemed to gather into a small, crowded moment. A man in uniform was standing near a cafe, waiting for something, though it wasn't clear what. His uniform was neat but showed signs of wear. It was not the kind of outfit that shouted wealth or status, yet it held a quiet dignity. The man's posture was straight, shoulders back, and his hands rested calmly at his sides. He seemed aware of the eyes around him, but he did not move to engage or confront anyone. He was a figure of quiet authority in the midst of the city's casual chaos. A small group of young people noticed him. They were noisy, dressed in bright clothes and clearly in high spirits. They nudged each other and pointed, whispering words meant to draw attention to the man in uniform. One of them made a snide comment about his appearance. The others laughed, and soon their laughter grew louder. The mocking seemed harmless at first, just teasing, but there was a sharpness to their voices that cut through the afternoon calm. The man in uniform did not respond. He stayed still, his eyes forward, but a hint of awareness flickered across his face. The group around him did not seem to notice the subtle strength in his gaze. They continued to make jokes, imitating the way he walked, the way he held himself, and even the neatness of his uniform. They didn't understand that each laugh was being met with patience and control rather than irritation. Other people walking by began to slow down, curious. Some frowned at the young people, sensing the cruelty in their laughter, but did not intervene. The cafe tables nearby were filled with people sipping drinks and glancing occasionally, uncertain whether to watch or ignore the scene. There was a strange tension in the air, a mix of amusement, discomfort, and curiosity. The man in uniform shifted slightly, a movement so subtle it almost went unnoticed. He straightened his jacket and adjusted the hat on his head. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight. It was not arrogance. It was presence. The way he carried himself told a story, though none in the crowd knew what that story was. Yet some onlookers felt it without understanding why. The young people grew bolder. They began to speak louder, their words meant to provoke. One of them stepped closer and mimicked a salute, making a face that was meant to be funny. Another laughed and said something that made the first one almost fall over with giggles. The crowd of onlookers grew, some leaning on lampposts or windowsills, drawn in by the unfolding scene. It was human nature, after all, to watch, even if part of the watcher's mind felt uneasy. Despite the laughter, the man in uniform did not flinch. He did not react with anger, nor did he smile in acknowledgement. He remained a calm figure amidst the storm of teasing. His eyes scanned the street, but not in a threatening way, more in a way that measured the scene, understanding it fully without a word. His presence was steady, like the quiet rhythm of the city itself. The mocking group noticed that their jokes were met with nothing but silence. For a moment they looked at each other, unsure. The laughter began to falter, replaced with nervous chuckles. They had expected reactions, anger, embarrassment, or at least some sign of irritation. But the man in uniform gave them none. He simply stood there, calm and composed, as if the laughter was a distant sound not directed at him at all. Some of the bystanders began to murmur to each other. "Who is he?" someone whispered. Another replied, "I don't know, but there's something about him. He doesn't seem like someone to mess with." The murmurs spread quietly among the crowd, curiosity taking the place of amusement. People leaned forward slightly, trying to see the man more clearly, noticing details they had overlooked before. There were small medals on his chest, and his hat bore a symbol that suggested honor and service. There was a history in the lines of his face, a quiet story written in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes. The young people began to feel the first pangs of doubt. They glanced at each other nervously, unsure how to proceed. Their teasing had drawn attention, but the attention was no longer entirely on them. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. Laughter, once so easy and spontaneous, became uncertain. They did not understand why, but the air around the man in uniform seemed to hold a kind of weight, a presence that demanded recognition. The city continued around them, oblivious to the tension gathering at this one corner. A bicycle bell rang, A dog barked, and a street musician played a soft tune that mingled with the sounds of conversation. Yet amidst all of this, the small scene at the cafe corner felt separate, almost suspended in time. It was a moment where ordinary life brushed against something extraordinary, something that would leave its mark on those who witnessed it. The man in uniform took a small step forward, slow and measured. It was the kind of movement that held authority without aggression. The crowd instinctively parted slightly, giving him space. Even the young people who had been mocking him stepped back, unsure how to respond. The laughter had completely stopped. The air was thick with expectation, a silent acknowledgement that something was about to happen. The man looked around at the gathered crowd. His eyes met those of strangers, of those who had laughed and those who had only watched. There was no judgment in his gaze, only clarity and calm. It was a gaze that seemed to see everything, to understand the trivialities and the deeper truths in equal measure. The silence that fell over the corner was not forced. It was earned, a quiet recognition of presence and dignity. The city carried on, but for those standing there, time seemed to stretch. People shifted, uncomfortable yet drawn in, caught between curiosity and respect. The mocking group fidgeted, their previous confidence waning. The man in uniform remained still, his calmness a stark contrast to the nervous energy around him. Each breath he took seemed deliberate, a quiet rhythm that resonated without sound. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows on the street, the scene held a strange beauty. It was not a dramatic confrontation nor a heroic act of force. It was simply a man standing with dignity, a figure of quiet strength amidst a fleeting moment of ridicule. And in that moment, everyone watching felt it, the subtle power of presence, of quiet courage, and the unspoken message that some things are not to be taken lightly. No one knew the man's story yet, but already, the crowd sensed that it was a story worth hearing. They had come to see a joke, a moment of entertainment, but instead they found something different, something that made them pause and reconsider. And so in that city street with its ordinary sounds and scents, the first part of a story began, one that would leave its mark on everyone who stood there and watched quietly, waiting for what came next. The man in uniform stood still, yet there was a subtle movement in the way he held himself. His eyes swept slowly across the gathering crowd, taking in every detail, every expression. It was not the kind of glance that threatened. It was something calmer, almost like a teacher observing a classroom before speaking. The young people who had been laughing earlier began to notice the seriousness in his gaze, a weight that made their previous joke seem insignificant. One of them shifted nervously, fidgeting with a backpack strap, while another avoided eye contact entirely. Their laughter had dried up, replaced with a growing uncertainty. The man in uniform did not speak yet, but his presence alone had begun to change the energy around him. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier, more attentive. People who had been passing by slowed their steps, curious about the quiet authority radiating from him. The man took a small step forward, measured and deliberate. The sound of his polished shoes against the pavement seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the low hum of the street. It was not aggressive, yet the crowd instinctively created a small circle of space around him. Some of the young people glanced at each other, realizing that the attention they had hoped to draw was now shifting toward something they did not understand. Their confidence wavered, replaced with a hesitant nervousness. Nearby, a street vendor paused in his work, wiping his hands on a cloth drawn by the tension. Even a dog on a leash stopped its playful barking, tilting its head toward the man as if sensing the unusual calm that now seemed to fill the street. The people sitting at the cafe tables leaned forward slightly, curious. It was rare to see someone who could hold attention without saying a word, and even rarer to see a group of people so captivated without any force or spectacle. The man in uniform lifted one hand slowly, not in a threatening gesture, but in a manner that naturally drew the crowd's eyes to him. It was the kind of movement that suggested he was about to speak, but no one knew what to expect. Silence had settled, almost heavy in its weight. People stopped mid-step, their conversations dying on their lips. Even the young people who had laughed at him earlier seemed frozen, unsure how to act. They had expected anger or embarrassment, perhaps a sharp retort, but none came. A small detail caught the attention of a few bystanders. The medals pinned to his chest. They were not flashy or new. They were subtle, telling a story of service and sacrifice. A slight crease on his uniform hinted at long days of duty, and the careful way he wore it suggested pride rather than vanity. Slowly, whispers began to ripple through the crowd, soft enough not to disturb the stillness entirely. "Who is he?" someone asked quietly. Another replied, "He has done something important. I can feel it." The young people's eyes darted from one side to the other. One of them mumbled something under their breath, trying to regain a sense of control over the situation, but the words fell flat. The man's calm presence had taken the energy from their mockery. Their laughter, once loud and easy, had vanished, leaving a void filled with tension and curiosity. It was a strange feeling for them, as though the world had shifted slightly and they were no longer in the center of it. The man in uniform began to walk slowly toward the middle of the small circle formed by the crowd. His steps were even, measured, and his posture never faltered. Each footfall seemed to carry quiet authority, drawing attention without demanding it. Some onlookers felt a shiver of anticipation, though no one could say why. It was not fear in the usual sense, nor was it awe alone. It was a deep, instinctive recognition of presence. A woman with a stroller paused, gently holding her child closer. An older man stopped, leaning on his cane, his curiosity piqued by the unusual scene. People who had initially ignored the corner were now stopping to watch, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Even the laughter from the young people had reduced to uncomfortable whispers, replaced by uncertain glances and nervous shuffling. The man in uniform reached the center of the crowd and stopped again. He looked around, taking in the faces before him. There was no anger, no judgment, only a calm attentiveness. His eyes seemed to see not only what was happening on the surface, but also what lay beneath. The intentions, the insecurities, the lack of understanding. The street around him felt different now, quieter, as though holding its breath in anticipation. He raised both hands slightly, palms facing down, not in a demanding gesture, but as if to invite silence, reflection, and attention. The movement was simple, almost graceful, yet it carried an unmistakable weight. The crowd almost instinctively obeyed. Conversation stopped completely. The air seemed to pause, the hum of the city fading just enough to let the moment breathe. The young people who had mocked him earlier looked at each other in confusion. They had expected a reaction, perhaps anger or embarrassment, something they could laugh at or mock further. Instead, they found themselves confronted with calm authority, a presence that demanded respect without raising its voice. One of them stepped back, suddenly aware of how small and unprepared they felt in the face of such quiet strength. The man's eyes met those of the crowd one by one, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was a gaze that made people feel seen, truly seen, as if their thoughts and actions were acknowledged without condemnation. Some of the bystanders felt a sudden pang of humility, an awareness of their own behavior in contrast to the man's dignity. The laughter and mockery seemed distant now, almost trivial. Slowly, the man in uniform tilted his head, scanning the street as if measuring the distance, the people, and the energy in the air. It was a moment of quiet control, the kind that comes from experience and deep understanding. The crowd felt it, even if they could not articulate why. Something about him communicated that he had faced challenges far greater than a few teasing words, that he had earned his composure through trials and responsibility. As the minutes passed, the street seemed to hold its breath along with the crowd. The young people shifted nervously, aware that their teasing had lost its effect. The other bystanders, once passive, now watched attentively, sensing that a story was about to be told. The man in uniform had transformed the energy of the crowd without speaking a word, creating a space where attention and respect had replaced laughter and mockery. A soft breeze drifted through the street, rustling papers and light fabrics, yet it could not disturb the quiet that had fallen. The city moved around them, people walking past, cars humming along the street. But the corner where the man stood felt suspended in time. The calm authority radiating from him was palpable, affecting everyone who had paused to notice. The young people exchanged uncertain glances. One of them whispered, almost inaudibly, "I don't think we should—" The words trailed off, incomplete, as the weight of the man's presence silenced them further. It was a strange realization, to be confronted not by anger but by dignity and calm, and they felt a sudden understanding that their actions had been shallow and thoughtless. The man in uniform took one more slow step forward, bringing himself fully into the center of the circle. He straightened slightly, shoulders back, head held high. He was ready now, not with hostility, but with a story that deserved to be heard. The air was thick with expectation, and every person in the crowd felt it. They had come to see a joke, perhaps, but they would leave having witnessed something far more meaningful. And so the stage was set. The laughter had ended, replaced with quiet curiosity and attention. The man in uniform stood ready, not with anger, not with demands, but with the calm dignity of someone who had lived through experience and carried it with grace. The crowd, once entertained by mockery, now waited unknowingly, holding its breath, waiting for the words that would soon fill the silence and leave an impression that none of them would forget. The man in uniform took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. It was a quiet confidence, one built over years of experience, and it radiated from him naturally. The young people who had mocked him were frozen, unsure what to do next. Their laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. The crowd around them leaned in slightly, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. He raised his hand, a gentle motion, not demanding attention, but inviting it. The subtle gesture seemed to hush the city itself, or at least the part of it that had gathered at that corner. Conversation faded into silence. The murmur of the cafe distant now, and even the sounds of the street seemed softened. It was as if time had slowed, giving space for the moment to breathe. For a brief instant, there was a hush of anticipation. Everyone felt it, the pause before something important is revealed. The man's uniform, once the target of ridicule, now spoke of discipline, responsibility, and experiences that could not be understood at a glance. Small details became more noticeable: the medals on his chest, the slight wear on his boots, the steady way he held his hands. These were signs of service, of challenges faced, of courage quietly carried. He began to speak, his voice calm, low, and steady. It was not loud, but it carried. The words cut through the quiet, catching everyone off guard. They were not the kind of words that demanded obedience. They were the kind that commanded respect through their sincerity. He spoke of his years of service, of the situations he had faced, and of the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Each word carried weight because it came from lived experience, not from the desire to impress. The crowd listened intently. The young people, once bold and mocking, now glanced nervously at each other. They had not expected a story, a real-life lesson, and it unsettled them. The seriousness in his tone and the clarity of his words left no room for laughter. Even those who had only watched from the edges felt the power in his calm voice, feeling compelled to listen and absorb the meaning behind it. He spoke of the fear and uncertainty he had faced, of situations where quick thinking and courage made the difference between life and death. He described moments when he had seen people struggle, people who relied on him to act, to lead, and to protect. His voice did not carry anger, nor did it carry pride. It carried honesty and a quiet humility that made every listener aware of the sacrifices that often go unnoticed. As he shared these experiences, the crowd began to shift. The mocking young people lowered their eyes, some ashamed, others silent, reflecting on the thoughtlessness of their actions. The people who had only watched now felt a mix of admiration and gratitude, recognizing the weight of what the man had endured. The atmosphere had transformed completely from amusement to respect, a silent acknowledgement that some things are beyond jokes and ridicule. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The silence was not awkward. It was full, heavy with understanding. People realized that the laughter and mockery of earlier had been replaced by something far more powerful: awareness. They had glimpsed a life of service, of courage, and of responsibility, and they could not ignore it. The man's presence, once a target of ridicule, had become a symbol of integrity and strength. A few of the onlookers exchanged quiet whispers, but they were careful not to disturb the moment. "I never realized," one murmured, a thought trailing off into the quiet. Another simply nodded, eyes fixed on the man as if he had just revealed something essential about the world. The young people, still standing awkwardly, felt the weight of their previous behavior and understood that respect was something earned, not assumed. The man continued, speaking about the importance of empathy and understanding, about seeing the value in every individual regardless of circumstance. He described how small actions could have lasting effects and how respect for others is not just a courtesy but a responsibility. The words were simple, clear, and unadorned, yet they carried profound meaning. Every listener felt the truth in them, sensing that this was not a speech designed to impress but a sharing of lived reality. As he spoke, the crowd began to see the uniform differently. It was no longer a target for jokes. It was a reminder of commitment, of work done quietly and diligently. People's perceptions shifted. The focus moved from appearance to substance. They could see the life behind the uniform, the choices, the risks, and the dedication it represented. Even the young people who had mocked him earlier seemed to shrink under the realization, recognizing the gap between their assumptions and reality. The man's voice remained calm, steady, and unhurried. He did not rush his words, nor did he look for applause. Instead, he allowed each phrase to land, each sentence to create understanding. The city's usual distractions, the cars, the chatter, the distant music seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the truth in his voice and the attention of the people surrounding him. The crowd began to absorb the lesson, the quiet power of courage and humility. Eyes that had once mocked now looked with respect. Postures that had been casual and carefree now straightened slightly, as if the body itself recognized the weight of what had been shared. People felt an unspoken bond with the man, a connection formed not through familiarity, but through recognition of integrity and strength. He spoke of the responsibility of standing up when others could not, of facing fear with resolve, and of carrying oneself with dignity regardless of circumstances. The message was clear. True courage is quiet, consistent, and often unnoticed, but it leaves a mark on those who witness it. Every word added to the atmosphere, creating a sense of reflection and introspection among all present. Finally, he lowered his hands and looked at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. The silence remained, but it was no longer tense or uncertain. It was thoughtful, reflective, filled with awareness. The young people who had laughed before now avoided eye contact, humbled by the realization of their own behavior. Others in the crowd felt a mix of admiration and gratitude, silently acknowledging the lessons shared in a few short moments. The man in uniform had spoken, and without raising his voice or demanding attention, he had transformed the energy of the crowd completely. Mockery had turned into respect, laughter into understanding, and curiosity into deep reflection. The weight of his experiences, the quiet authority in his presence, and the sincerity of his words had made an impact that would not be forgotten. As he stepped back slightly, allowing space for the crowd to breathe, a few murmurs of acknowledgement began to spread. Not loud, not intrusive, but small signs that people were taking in the lesson, quietly appreciating the moment. The young people who had mocked him earlier looked at each other, no longer bold but thoughtful. They understood that there was something greater than amusement in this moment, something worth respecting and remembering. The street returned slowly to its usual rhythm, but the corner where the man had spoken felt different. Those who had gathered would carry the memory of this moment, a quiet story of courage, humility, and dignity that spoke louder than words or jokes. The man in uniform had turned ridicule into reflection, and in doing so had left an indelible mark on everyone who had been present. The lesson was simple, clear, and powerful. Respect comes from understanding, and true courage speaks even in silence. The man in uniform stood at the center of the small circle that had formed, and the city around him seemed to fade away. His presence was steady, calm, and deliberate, and the crowd's attention was fully on him. The young people who had laughed earlier were silent, their faces showing surprise, curiosity, and a touch of shame. The other bystanders were leaning in, waiting for what he would say next. There was a sense of expectancy that hung in the air, heavy but not oppressive. He began to speak again, slowly and clearly. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived through experiences that few could imagine. He spoke about his early days in service, the reasons he had chosen this path, and the challenges that had shaped him. The words were simple, but they were full of honesty and emotion. He described long nights, difficult decisions, and moments when fear and doubt were constant companions. As he shared his story, the crowd listened with rapt attention. The young people who had mocked him earlier looked down, realizing the gap between their assumptions and reality. The man did not speak to shame them. He spoke to share the truth of his experiences and the lessons he had learned. His tone was steady, free of anger or resentment. There was a quiet strength in his voice that made every listener feel the weight of his words. He spoke of the people he had helped, sometimes in ways that were unnoticed by others. He described the quiet satisfaction of a job done well, the importance of small actions, and the impact one person can have on the lives of many. The stories he told were human, relatable, and deeply moving. They carried a universal truth. Courage is not always loud, and heroism is not always recognized. The crowd began to feel the emotion in his words. Some eyes were moist, not from sadness but from empathy. They could imagine the sacrifices he had made, the moments of doubt, and the determination it took to keep moving forward. The young people who had mocked him were now reflective, their previous behavior seeming insignificant in light of the man's experiences. They had expected a simple moment of entertainment, but instead they were witnessing a life of dedication, courage, and integrity. He paused occasionally, letting each point sink in. The silence was not awkward. It was full and meaningful. People could feel the weight of his experiences, the years of service, and the challenges faced. Every word he spoke added depth to the image of the man in uniform, transforming him from a figure of ridicule into a symbol of strength, humility, and honor. He spoke about responsibility, the kind that comes not from desire but from necessity. He described times when he had to make difficult choices, balancing duty with compassion, strength with understanding. The audience felt the honesty in his words, and even the young people who had mocked him earlier could not deny the truth they were hearing. Respect was no longer optional. It had become inevitable. He then shared stories of resilience, of facing fear and uncertainty with determination. He described moments when failure was possible and yet courage carried him through. These were not tales of glory, but of perseverance, commitment, and the quiet satisfaction of doing what needed to be done. Each story left an impression on the crowd, a reminder that life often tests people in ways they cannot predict, and that true character shows in how one responds. The man also spoke of empathy and understanding, of seeing people for who they were rather than judging them by appearances. He talked about the importance of kindness, the small gestures that make a difference, and the lasting impact of treating others with respect. The crowd absorbed every word, realizing that these lessons were not only about service but about life itself. His experiences had taught him something universal, and he shared it generously, without condescension or self-importance. As he continued, the young people who had laughed before now showed signs of reflection. One fidgeted nervously, another avoided eye contact, and yet another simply listened, absorbing the gravity of the man's words. They had come expecting a joke, perhaps even to mock further, but they had received something far more valuable, a glimpse into a life lived with courage, dignity, and purpose. Their perspective had shifted, and a sense of humility began to take root. The bystanders who had only watched from the edges were equally affected. They could see the weight of the man's experiences in the lines of his face, in the way he held himself, and in the calm authority of his voice. Each word he spoke was imbued with authenticity, and it resonated deeply with everyone present. There was a collective awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that this moment was extraordinary. He spoke of the lessons learned over the years, lessons about bravery, patience, compassion, and respect. His words were not meant to instruct or lecture. They were meant to share truth and experience. The simplicity of his language made the message accessible to everyone, while the depth of his experiences gave it power. The crowd could feel the sincerity, and it moved them in ways that laughter never could. As the man in uniform finished his speech, there was a pause. No one spoke. No one moved. The moment held, suspended in the city's usual rhythm. People were processing what they had heard, reflecting on their own lives, their own choices, and their own assumptions. The young people who had mocked him were quiet, some with heads bowed, some with thoughtful expressions. They had learned something that could not be forgotten, a lesson delivered not with anger or punishment but with quiet dignity. Finally, a few murmurs of appreciation began to ripple through the crowd. Not loud, not boisterous, but sincere and respectful. People nodded to each other, acknowledging what they had witnessed. Some offered quiet words of thanks, others simply stood in thoughtful silence. The street had returned to life around them, but the corner where the man had stood felt different, changed by the stories and the truth he had shared. The man in uniform looked around at the crowd one last time. His gaze was calm, steady, and unassuming. There was no expectation of reward or recognition. He had shared his experiences, and in doing so, had transformed the mood of the street. Respect had replaced ridicule, understanding had replaced judgment, and empathy had taken the place of indifference. As he took a step back, Giving space to the crowd to breathe, people felt a lingering sense of admiration. They had been part of a moment that was more than ordinary, a moment that reminded them of courage, humility, and the quiet power of life experience. The young people who had laughed earlier were reflective, changed in a small but meaningful way, realizing that mockery can be fleeting, but understanding lasts. The man in uniform began to walk slowly away, leaving the circle he had held with dignity. His presence lingered in the minds of the people who had watched and listened. They carried with them a sense of respect and awareness that would not fade quickly. The lesson was clear and human. Courage, humility, and integrity are qualities that leave a mark, not through spectacle, but through lived experience and the quiet sharing of truth. And so, the crowd dispersed gradually, each person carrying a small piece of the story in their hearts. The man in uniform walked down the street, unnoticed by most, but leaving behind a powerful impression. His words, his calm authority, and his human presence had created a moment that transformed ordinary bystanders into witnesses of courage and empathy. The lesson of the day was simple yet profound. True strength is often quiet, and respect is earned through actions, not appearances. The man in uniform walked slowly away from the small circle of people who had gathered around him. Each step was calm, deliberate, and measured. The crowd, once filled with laughter and mockery, now followed him with their eyes silent and thoughtful. Something had shifted in their hearts, a quiet understanding of the value of courage, humility, and respect. They had witnessed something that could not be unseen, a lesson delivered not with force but with the quiet dignity of experience. The young people who had mocked him earlier were still standing near the cafe, unsure what to do. Their faces reflected a mix of surprise, embarrassment, and reflection. They had expected a moment of amusement, something to laugh about and dismiss, but they had received a glimpse into a life of dedication and service. It was a humbling experience, one that made them reconsider their own behavior and assumptions. They shifted from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact, realizing that respect was not something to take lightly. Other bystanders who had watched the scene unfold were equally affected. Some whispered to each other, quietly commenting on what they had just witnessed. Others simply stood in silence, reflecting on the words and presence of the man in uniform. There was a shared understanding, unspoken yet palpable, that this was a moment of human connection and recognition. People were no longer just passing by. They were participating in something meaningful, even if silently. The street around them began to return to its usual rhythm. Cars moved along, conversations resumed, and the sounds of the city filled the air once again. Yet in the minds of those who had gathered, the moment lingered. The calm authority and the honesty of the man's words had left an impression that could not be erased. It was as if the corner itself had been transformed, marked by the presence of someone who carried both experience and humility with grace. Some of the young people began to talk quietly among themselves. One of them admitted almost in a whisper that they had been wrong to mock him. Another nodded, acknowledging the lesson in humility they had just received. There was no need for dramatic gestures or loud apologies. The understanding itself was enough. They had seen that respect was earned through actions and character, not through appearances or assumptions. A woman who had been watching with her child smiled softly. She leaned down to speak to the child about what had happened, explaining in simple words the importance of courage and dignity. It was a teaching moment, a chance to instill values that might grow and influence others. The man in uniform had given more than a story. He had provided an example, a living demonstration of principles worth following. The man himself did not turn back to see the effect he had created. His focus remained steady, moving forward with the quiet confidence that had carried him through years of service. He did not need recognition or thanks. The impact of his presence and his words was enough. The respect he had earned was evident in the faces and postures of the people around him, and that silent acknowledgement was more powerful than any applause. As he walked down the street, some people continued to watch him, their thoughts lingering on the lessons they had learned. Others returned to their routines, but with a sense of reflection that would remain with them. The energy of the street had shifted subtly, influenced by the presence of someone who embodied integrity, humility, and courage. The day continued, yet it felt different, marked by the understanding that small actions and quiet strength could leave a lasting impression. A few of the bystanders began to speak softly about what they had seen, sharing their thoughts with those around them. They commented on the man's calm demeanor, the honesty in his voice, and the way he had communicated without aggression. They remarked on the power of presence and how respect and understanding could be conveyed through simple, sincere actions. It was a ripple effect, spreading quietly among the crowd, touching those who had not been directly involved. The young people who had mocked him earlier began to move on, but their steps were slower, more thoughtful. They carried with them the memory of the man's words and actions, understanding that moments of reflection were more valuable than fleeting amusement. They had learned that humility and respect are not abstract concepts. They are lived experiences, visible in the way people carry themselves and in the choices they make. The man in uniform eventually disappeared from view, moving down the street with the quiet determination of someone who has fulfilled a duty, not for recognition, but because it was necessary. Yet his presence remained in the minds of those who had witnessed him. The lessons of courage, humility, and dignity had been imparted without force, and they resonated deeply with everyone present. It was a reminder that true strength often speaks softly, but it is heard clearly by those willing to listen. As the crowd dispersed completely, the people carried a sense of introspection. Conversations resumed, but with a tone of thoughtfulness. Children were reminded to be kind. Adults reflected on their assumptions, and even casual passers-by felt a shift in perspective. The corner of the street had become a place of learning, a small stage for a human story that would remain in memory long after the man had walked away. The story of the man in uniform, who had been mocked and then revered, was one that everyone carried in a personal way. It was not a story of dramatic heroism or grand gestures, but of everyday courage, humility, and integrity. It was a reminder that respect is not given automatically. It is recognized through actions and character. It was a lesson that could inspire quiet reflection and ultimately positive change in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The sun began to set, casting long shadows along the streets and cafes. The city continued its rhythm, unaware of the small but profound moment that had occurred on that corner. Yet, for those who had paused to observe, the experience lingered. The memory of calm authority, sincere words, and the power of presence would remain with them, influencing how they approached others and how they carried themselves. And so, the man in uniform became more than a figure on the street. He became a symbol of the quiet, steadfast courage that exists in everyday life, a reminder that dignity and respect are earned through action and lived experience. The lessons of the day, imparted without anger or spectacle, remained in the hearts of all who had witnessed them. The street returned to normal, yet it was forever marked by a moment of true humanity, reflection, and understanding. The story had ended, but its impact continued, quietly shaping those who had been fortunate enough to see it unfold.